This is a story I heard once from a guy named Nick Calhoun. We met through mutual friends during a late-night hangout, the kind where people start swapping strange tales over a few beers. Nick wasn't the type to embellish. He had this dead serious way of talking that made you sit up and listen. His story still lingers in my mind, like a cold draft creeping through a closed window. It happened during winter in upstate New York. Nick was part of an organized group trip, a getaway arranged by some travel agency promising a weekend of scenic hikes and rustic charm. The group consisted of about a dozen people, strangers to each other, crammed into 2 vans loaded with supplies. The destination was a remote lodge deep in the Adirondack woods. Nick wasn't thrilled about the trip, but he had been convinced by a friend who bailed at the last minute, leaving him stuck. Retail had been grinding him down lately, and maybe he figured some fresh air and new faces would do him good. A Boulder native, Nick was used to cold winters and winding roads, but the icy forests of New York felt different. Darker, heavier, like they'd been waiting too long for something to happen. Things went wrong early. One of the vans broke down on a desolate stretch of road, its engine coughing out for good just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. Nick, who had a knack for fixing cars, offered to take a look, but the cold had already seized the vehicle like a vice. The second van had already gone ahead, leaving the stranded group to figure things out on their own. They decided to camp by the roadside for the night. The nearest town was too far to walk in the dark, and cell service was non-existent. They built a fire, wrapped themselves in blankets, and shared awkward small talk to break the tension. Nick remembered the air was so cold it felt like it could freeze your lungs. He kept glancing at the forest, the shadows between the trees shifting uneasily under the firelight. The first sign came late at night, long after most of the group had dozed off. Nick was still awake, tending the fire and trying to keep his mind from wandering too far. That's when he heard it, a distant, keening wail that echoed through the woods. It wasn't the cry of an animal, nor was it human. It was something in between, a sound that prickled at the back of his neck and made his breath catch in his throat. He wasn't the only one who heard it. A couple of the others stirred, exchanging nervous glances but saying nothing. Nick shrugged it off, or tried to. The stories he'd read about the Adirondacks came flooding back, tales of strange figures, ghostly lights, and things best left unseen. He told himself it was the wind, a trick of the mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, listening. The attack came without warning. One moment they were sitting around the fire, sharing nervous laughter. The next, something tore into their camp like a whirlwind of claws and teeth. It was fast, too fast to see clearly, and it moved with a predatory grace that sent them scattering. Nick barely had time to grab a burning log from the fire before he saw it. A gaunt, towering figure, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight, and its teeth, they were too many, too sharp. The creature lunged, its clawed hand raking across the chest of one of the campers, who went down screaming. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold air. Nick swung the burning log, the flames licking at the creature's face, and it recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek before vanishing into the trees. The survivors huddled together, shaken and bleeding. They couldn't leave, the van was useless, and the forest was no safer. They spent the night in terror, their fire dwindling as they tried to stay awake, listening for the sound of claws on snow. By morning, the sun rose bright and cold, casting long shadows over the blood-stained campsite. They debated their options and decided to make a break for the nearest town, sticking together and moving as silently as possible. Nick took the lead, his mechanic's instincts kicking in as he scanned for signs of danger. The creature's tracks were everywhere, circling the camp like a predator toying with its prey. They moved through the woods, the snow crunching underfoot, every sound magnified by the oppressive silence. The creature followed, its presence a constant, unseen menace. They caught glimpses of it. A flash of movement, a low growl that set their teeth on edge. But it never struck. Not yet. One of the group didn't make it. He panicked, breaking into a run, and the creature was on him in seconds. The screams were short, cut off with a wet, tearing sound that sent the rest of them into a terrified sprint. They reached the town just as the sun began to set, stumbling into the main street like ghosts. No one believed their story, of course. Nick didn't blame them. It sounded impossible, like something out of a horror movie, but he knew what he'd seen. The Adirondacks had their secrets, and the Wendigo was one of them. Nick never went back to the woods after that. He returned to Boulder, to the safety of his garage and the familiar hum of engines. But sometimes on cold winter nights, he'd find himself staring out the window, half expecting to see glowing eyes watching from the dark. The first snowfall of the season had started hours earlier, dusting the rugged hills of Montana with a thin, deceptive layer of beauty. We were just a group of 6 travelers on a detour, lured by the promise of big skies and endless horizons. Dean Smith was among us, a gardener from Boulder who found his passion in movies and the occasional road trip. We'd pulled off the main highway for gas, our breath fogging in the frigid air, when everything began to spiral into something none of us could comprehend. The gas station was a time-worn shack, more weather-beaten than anything else in the vast expanse around it. Snow clung to the gnarled wooden awning. We stocked up on snacks and supplies while the others filled the tank. I remember Dean stepping out, glancing at the distant tree line. He muttered something about how the snowfall reminded him of scenes from a movie. He had that distracted air of someone piecing together a script in their head. But the gas pump clicked to a stop, and the clerk, a wiry man with an expression that flickered between boredom and unease, mumbled something about strays in the area. None of us paid him much mind. The plan was to push forward, but the van wouldn't start. A groan of frustration went through the group. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the eerie calm of the Montana woods and the creeping cold as company. One of us suggested staying the night near the gas station, reasoning that it'd be safer. We lit a fire in a clearing nearby, close enough to the building that we could make a quick retreat if needed. The night wrapped us in its silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the occasional snap of a branch in the woods. Dean sat near the flames, poking at the embers. He said something about a show he'd watched once, something to do with cryptids, skinwalkers, and the eerie lore surrounding them. Someone laughed it off, calling it nonsense, but Dean's tone lingered in the air. He wasn't the type to scare easily. Then we heard it. A rustling at first. Too deliberate to be the wind, too erratic to be an animal. Dean froze mid-sentence. We all turned toward the sound. It was faint at first, like footsteps circling just beyond the reach of the firelight. The air grew heavy, and then we saw it, or rather the shadow of it. A figure taller than any of us, moving in a disjointed, almost puppet-like gait. It stayed just beyond the light, only partially illuminated when it stopped behind a skeletal tree. Its eyes gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the fire's glow. Someone whispered, "What the hell is that?" No one answered. The figure let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't a sound any of us could place, part animal, part human, part something else. Then it stepped closer, and for a moment we glimpsed it. Long limbs covered in matted fur or maybe twisted skin. Its face was distorted, like something caught mid-transformation. A snout, but not quite. Teeth that seemed too sharp, too jagged. Panic set in. Someone screamed, and the thing lunged. It was fast, impossibly fast. Dean grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it wildly as the others scrambled to their feet. The creature flinched back, but its movement was calculated, almost mocking. We bolted, leaving the fire raging behind us. The creature pursued, crashing through the underbrush. It didn't attack immediately. It toyed with us, circling, letting out unearthly cries that seemed to come from all directions at once. Dean took the lead, urging us toward the van. I remember him saying, "Stick together. Don't stop." But in the chaos, one of us, a woman whose name I never learned, stumbled. The thing was on her in seconds. The scream that followed chilled us more than the icy wind. We didn't look back. We reached the van, piling inside. Dean was at the driver's seat, desperately turning the ignition. The engine sputtered to life just as the creature slammed against the side of the van. Its claws tore into the metal with a screech that drowned out our cries. Dean floored it and the van lurched forward, tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. The creature chased us, keeping pace with the vehicle for what felt like an eternity before veering off into the darkness. We didn't stop driving until we reached the next town. We didn't call the police. What could we have said? Montana has its share of legends, they say. The Skinwalker is one of them. But legends don't rip into steel or stare at you with eyes that seem to bore into your soul. Dean doesn't talk about it much anymore. None of us do. But every now and then, when I see snow falling quietly in the woods, I think of that night and the shadow that still lingers just beyond the light. The wind was restless that spring in Montana, carrying a faint chill through the budding trees and grassy plains. The group that gathered for the travel agency's spring retreat had expected brisk days and chilly nights, but no one anticipated what would happen out there. It started as just another getaway, an attempt to showcase the untamed beauty of the Montana wilderness. Among them was a man named Jared Fisher. He was an IT specialist from Miami, drawn to the retreat by the promise of crisp air and a chance to indulge in his passion for hunting. Jared had brought along his dog, Bruno, a muscular mutt with a shaggy coat that seemed perpetually on edge. Miami's sprawl of high-rises and sunlit beaches felt worlds away as the group settled into their temporary home, a sprawling rustic cabin nestled on the edge of the woods. The first day was uneventful, save for the wind that howled persistently through the trees. Jared couldn't help but think back to Miami, to the weekend spent tinkering with his hunting gear or catching online videos about cryptid sightings, urban legends he used to laugh off. Montana's wide-open spaces and untamed wilderness made him wonder if those stories held more truth than he wanted to admit. Bruno was jittery from the moment they arrived. The dog, usually steady and unshakable, prowled the perimeter of the cabin, growling low at the swaying shadows of the trees. Jared tried to calm him, chalking it up to unfamiliar smells and the incessant wind. The first night passed without incident, though no one slept well. The wind seemed to carry strange sounds, a distant rustling, a low groan that could have been the trees but felt off. Jared dismissed it, telling himself it was his imagination fueled by too many late-night internet rabbit holes. The second night was when things began to unravel. The group had gathered around a fire pit near the cabin, sharing drinks and stories as the wind whipped through the trees. Jared noticed Bruno staring fixedly into the darkness, his ears pricked, his growls escalating into sharp, urgent barks. Probably just a deer, someone muttered, though their voice wavered. Jared grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam toward the woods. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place, just the tangled underbrush and swaying trees. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, hunched and unmoving. Jared squinted and his breath caught. Behind one of the trees, something sat. Its form was vaguely humanoid, but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. "Do you see that?" Jared whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The group fell silent, their laughter and chatter replaced by a collective unease. Someone else shone a flashlight, but the beam seemed to scatter uselessly in the swirling wind. The shape remained still, watching. Bruno lunged toward the woods, barking furiously. Jared grabbed his collar, pulling him back as the shape shifted slightly, its head tilting in a way that made the hair on his neck stand up. "Back inside," Jared said firmly, his voice cutting through the rising panic. They retreated to the cabin, bolting the doors and windows. The fire outside burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Inside, they whispered nervously about what they'd seen or thought they'd seen. Jared couldn't shake the image of that thing behind the tree, the way it seemed to observe them with an intelligence that felt predatory. Around midnight, the scratching started. It was faint at first, like branches brushing against the cabin, but it grew louder, more deliberate. Bruno barked furiously at the door, his body rigid with fear. Jared armed himself with the hunting knife he'd brought, his heart pounding. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low guttural growl that reverberated through the cabin. Jared peeked through the window and his stomach turned. The figure was closer now, just at the edge of the firelight. Its face was obscured, but its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "It's watching us," someone whispered, their voice trembling. The group debated their options: stay and hope it left, or make a run for the cars parked behind the cabin. The scratching resumed, more insistent this time, as if the creature were testing the strength of the door. "We go," Jared said finally. "Now." They armed themselves with whatever they could find: knives, fire pokers, a hatchet from the woodpile, and slipped out the back, moving as quietly as possible. The wind masked their footsteps, but it also masked the creatures. The cars were just a few yards away, but it felt like an eternity. Jared clutched Bruno's collar, the dog's low growls vibrating against his hand. The others moved in a tight cluster, their breaths shallow and quick. Then it attacked. The creature burst from the shadows with terrifying speed, a blur of matted fur and glinting teeth. It swiped at one of the group, sending them sprawling into the snow. Jared turned, swinging his knife wildly. The blade connected, and the creature let out a deafening roar, retreating just long enough for them to reach the cars. They piled in, slamming doors and fumbling with keys. The engine roared to life, and Jared floored it, the tires spinning before finding traction. In the rearview mirror, he saw the creature watching them from the tree line, its glowing eyes the last thing visible as they sped away. The locals later told him about the legends. The dogman, a cryptid said to haunt the woods of Montana. Jared didn't need the stories to believe. He'd seen it, and he'd never forget.